So we want to take as much code as possible out of this class and put it in a separate class which we call a view model. And that is a plain old CLR object or a POCO. Now this is a two-step process. I'm going to give you a simple recipe. First, anywhere you have a reference to user interface objects like page or controls, you need to replace that with data binding. So that means in onAppearing method, we should not have a reference to playlists list view because this is a Xamarin Forms control. And if you want to decouple this code from Xamarin, we should remove a reference to list view. So instead of setting the item source in the code, we're going to expose a public property and use data binding in XAML. And you're going to see that in a second. Here's another example. Here we're setting the title property of the page. Again, this is causing dependency to Xamarin Forms. So instead of setting the title here, we want to use data binding. So let's go ahead and create a view model. Back in the solution, I'm going to create a new folder. Call it view models. Add a new class. Now this view model is for playlists page. So by convention, I call it playlists view model. So this is basically the model behind the playlists view or playlists page. It should have properties that represent the state of this page, like our observable collection, which is the list of our playlists. And it should have methods that represent the behavior of this page. Now back in the code behind. First, I'm going to grab this private field, our observable collection, and bring it into our view model. And by the way, we don't need this constructor. Let's bring in the namespace. Now, instead of a private field, we want to use a public property so we can use data binding because data binding only works with public properties. So, public. Now we need to change the name and use Pascal case. So, playlists. And to make it a property, get and private set. I don't want to set this from the outside. It's only the responsibility of this class to set this object to a new observable collection. Now that we have this property, we can go to our XAML. In our list view, we can set item source to a binding expression. Binding to playlists. But this is not a property of our code behind. It's a property of our view model. So we need to set that view model as the binding context for this page. So in the constructor, we set binding context to a new playlists view model. Now this object is our binding context, and that means we can bind to its various properties. Now back in the code behind again, we no longer need this line. Now I'm going to leave this onAppearing method here. We're probably going to use it later on. So back to our recipe, whenever you see a reference to a page or a control, you need to replace that with data binding. Here we have another example. We're setting the title property. So I'm going to delete this line here and instead go in the XAML, set the title here to a binding expression. Binding path equals playlists.count. And we can use string format to render it like this. This is exactly the same. Now back to our recipe. The second step is any event handlers you have in the code behind, you need to move them to your view model. But this is going to involve multiple steps. So first, I want to move onAddPlaylist. Let's go to our view model. I want to create a public void method called addPlaylist. So this view model is the model behind our view, our page. It should have properties that represent the state of the page and methods that represent the behavior of this page. When we click the add button, we want this method to be executed, right? Now back in the code behind, I'm going to take this code cut, and move it inside this new method. Note that this method does not have these weird arguments, object sender, event args. It's just a simple method. Now let's quickly fix these references. So we no longer have this private field. We change the name. We reference playlists. And here's the other. Now look at this method. It's a very simple method. All we are doing is adding a new playlist object to our observable collection. There is no dependency on Xamarin. There is no reference to a list view, to a page, nothing. It's a plain old CLR object. And we can easily unit test this, as I will show you later in the section. Now let's repeat this step one more time. We want to declare a method called public void select playlist. And this method should take an argument, the playlist that should be selected. So back in the code behind. Before we move the code, we actually need to implement the body of this event handler. So here we want to get this binding context and cast it as a playlist view model. Now we can call the add playlist method. And by the way, this is a temporary solution because we're going to do multiple step refactoring. Later, we'll remove this event handler entirely. Now, let's take the code inside this other event handler, cut, back to the view model, paste it here. Now, in the first line, we don't have E as the event arg anymore. Instead, we want to work with this playlist argument. So if playlist is null, do nothing, return. Now, we don't need this line anymore because this playlist object we get is already of type playlist, so we don't need to cast it. Delete. Next, we toggle the isFavorite property of playlist. So far, so good. And finally, look, we have another reference to our list view. So using the recipe I told you, we want to replace this with data binding. So I'm going to declare a public property in this view model called selected playlist and use data binding there. So public playlist selected playlist public property. And now I'm going to replace this line with selected playlist. Now let's go back to our XAML and set the binding expression. So here's our list view. I'm going to set selected item to a binding expression to the property called selected playlist. Now there is something we need to add here that you have not seen before. The data binding you have seen so far is what we call two-way binding. So imagine an entry that is bound to a property in our model. If we change this property in the model, the entry gets updated. Or if we type something in the entry, the underlying property in the model gets updated. So this is what we call two-way binding. But with our list view, this selected item by default does not use two-way binding. This is just the way they have implemented this in Xamarin. So we need to explicitly set the mode of binding to two-way. Okay, so remember this. Now finally, back to our code behind. In our event handler, again, we want to call the corresponding method in the view model. So we're going to do this binding context as playlists view model, and then call select playlist method. Now as the argument, we pass e.selected item. Now this is an object, so we need to explicitly cast this to playlist. Okay? So let's have a quick recap. This is our code behind. We have moved all the logic outside of this class. All we have here is the plumbing code. We're just delegating to the methods of the view model. Now let's take a look at the view model. We have a simple class with a couple of properties and a couple of methods. And there is absolutely no reference to Xamarin here. There is no reference to a list view or a page and so on. And by the way, don't think this observable collection is part of Xamarin. No, it's not. It's actually part of system.collections.object model. Now, before we move on to the next step, let's run the application and make sure everything works so far. So add a few playlists. Beautiful. Now let's select one of them. Okay, it turned pink. Favorite is true, but the item is not deselected. And that's something I was expecting. So we're going to fix this in the next lecture.